Good morning. Today is the 28th of October. I'm recording this at 11 a.m. And I been talking about the Middle East for some sessions. Obviously, things are still disastrous there, but there are two major topics that will be major throughout this century, and I thought I would approach one of them today. That is immigration and climate change. And I want to talk in terms of immigration in broadly international terms, because it's not just an American issue, it's an international issue. But let me just editorialize on yesterday, where President Trump had a rally in New York, in the biggest arena there. And one of his speakers referred to Puerto Rico as a garbage island. Garbage was, of course, already a pickup from Trump, who was referring to millions of legal and illegal immigrants as garbage. And the speaker, I don't know whether the speaker realized that Puerto Ricans are actually Americans and not some kind of, brown foreigners that you can discriminate against. Well, you can, of course, discriminate against Puerto Ricans, but they're certainly American citizens. And then, of course, Trump came on later about how he was going to empty the garbage cans on day one of several million people in the United States. So that's the state of play right now in the US. And not to minimize the fact that lots of people are trying to come to the United States, and some are seeking asylum. I'll talk about that in a minute. Some are trying to get in semi categories. But before I will get back to the US, but allow me to define some terms, because they're pretty much misrepresentative or not defined in the discussions about immigration, both in the United States and around the world. I'll only spend a few minutes on it, and I'm sorry about sounding so academic. The idea of a state slowly evolved over the century. And the modern idea of a state pretty much became customary by the end of the 19th century, although because of colonialism, much of the world was colonized. So you had a limited number of states until decolonization. Now there are almost 200. So what is a state? A state is actually a legal category. And in modern times, a state is a territory that has a boundary. Inside that boundary is a government that has the capacity to govern, and everything else being equal, a population, a citizenry, which identifies with living in that state. I know this sounds very academic, but what constitutes a state has even become more modern in the 20th century, in a sense that what I just defined is still at play. But generally speaking, if you want to declare a state, you can declare it, but unless it has these minimal characteristics, it will not be recognized as a state by the United Nations. And the United Nations is now the institution which recognizes a state. And when it's recognized, because it has the characteristics I mentioned, it joins the other states in the world. you can declare yourself a state, and people have declared themselves a state, or governments have declared areas a state, which have not been recognized. For example, during apartheid, South Africa wanted to declare some of the territories of various tribal groups, homelands, and declare that they should now be recognized internationally by states. And the United Nations said, no, this is phony baloney. These are not states. We won't recognize them as states. So just because a group of people or a territory declares itself a state, it does not become a state in international law until the United Nations recognizes it. Okay. All right. So then the question is, why is the word nationalism thrown around? Ideally, people who live inside a legally recognized state are nationals of that particular state. But what is a nation? A nation is not really a legal category. It is a group of people who identify themselves to belong together. And they can identify themselves to belong together for a variety of reasons: historical reasons, religious, language reasons, typically a combination. Now, the goal of a state is to be a nation state. That is to say, the people living in it also have a sense of national identity. But there are many states in the world that are recognized as states, which have groups of people living in them, which have ideas that they are really a different national identity, and either tolerate living within that state or else actually want a state of their own. Would be an example of that? The Kurds. They're spread out in various countries in the Middle East, and Turkey, and in Syria, and so forth. The Kurds don't have a state. Often they are seeking a state of their own, but they certainly have the characteristics, of a nation of people. In a sense, they have a language, they have a history, they like to think of themselves as a nation, but they're a nation without a state. And there are many countries in the world which are not cohesive nation state, hyphenated nation states. Namely, they have people living inside them who would prefer to either have an identity, not only an identity of their own and a language and maybe a religion, but would also like to have a legal entity somewhere, a territory with a border and all the accoutrements of a state, and to be recognized by the United Nations. So there is an elasticity in terms of what constitutes a state and what rights people have. Now, there are many variations on the theme, and I won't spend too much on them. For example, a country like Switzerland. People in Switzerland is a nation state. That is to say, it's a territory, it qualifies as a state, and the people living in it acknowledge that they're Swiss. But in addition, people in Switzerland have secondary identities. For example, the German-speaking Swiss, the French-speaking Swiss, the Italian-speaking Swiss. So in point of fact, you could have more than one identity, even though your legal loyalty is to the state in which you live. Okay, now why is this interesting, or why is it relevant? Because many people in the world are unhappy at the moment, and they have been historically for some time, for economic reasons, political reasons, for religious reasons, and feel discriminated against, or feel that they can't make a living and they would like to go somewhere else. Some people are simply seeking a better economic life or a better job. They want to work for a computer company in the Silicon Valley. They may still have Indian national identity, or they may be citizens of India, but they may also want to become citizens of the United States. Now, from the perspective of the United States, it used to be that you were supposed to only have one identity, citizenship in the United States. But for many people, they may be nationals and citizens of the United States, but they may also have citizens' right, let's say, in Spain or somewhere else. So this, I don't want to belabor this issue, but this has become somewhat complicated. The problem is that if for whatever reason you feel you want to or must leave the state that you live in, are other states obliged to take you in? So as we speak, there are somewhere between 40 million and 80 million people in the world who are refugees. That is to say, they have tried to leave their states. They're floating around out there. They're trying to gain entry and to stay somewhere else. Why is the gap so wide? Because 40 million, roughly speaking, are recognized by the United Nations, and the rest of them are also refugees, asylum seekers, and so forth that the United Nations hasn't as yet recognized. So we're talking the number of people who feel they must, for political reasons or economic reasons or religious discrimination reason, move from wherever they live to some other place is huge right now. Now, on the one hand, people want to go somewhere else because they feel they need to go somewhere else. On the other hand, the reason this, quite aside from the numbers involved, the reason this is a huge problem for the 20th century is that almost all countries of the world, including the United States, China, Japan, every major country in life, is now having a low birth rate, which means that its populations, its indigenous native citizens and population will not be enough to cover the economic activities of the state. So they need foreign workers. Now, you could have, therefore, say, well, if you need people to staff your economy, what's the problem of letting X hundreds of thousands or million people in who seek to live in your country and to settle in your country and work in your country? So, for example, when Trump talks about getting rid of all these millions of people who are not citizens and who either came here illegally or not, he doesn't mention the fact that a very large portion of the American economy is dependent on foreign labor. For example, agriculture. For example, caretakers. For example, fast food establishments. None of these categories, and there are some others, could possibly continue to be operational if all the people that somebody like Trump thinks ought to go back to wherever they came from were being sent away. Ditto, most industrial countries have already recognized it. For example, take Germany. After the Second World War, they needed additional workers. And West Germany, in particular, imported labor from Turkey, large numbers of Turkish laborers who were thought to be temporarily there. Well, many of them weren't temporarily there. They've been living there for decades. Their children were born in Germany. But Germany, until the last decade, has essentially said, well, these are foreigners. They can go back to Turkey at some point, and wouldn't recognize even the children who were born there, because unlike the United States, where if you're born in the United States, you're an American. By the way, Trump wants to get rid of that, the automatic citizenship for people born in the United States. That's another issue we may be confronting if Trump wins. But in any event, this got to be a big, political football in Germany. And in recent years, it has finally allowed Turks who've been living there for decades and their children who were born there to become German citizens. There are issues like that in many countries that allowed or wanted labor. That was an issue in Switzerland and in other industrial countries. Increasingly, it's an issue, for example, in Japan. Japan, for some years, has had Filipino and other workers augment the Japanese workforce, which is going to get more serious because the Japanese native indigenous population is quickly aging. And Japan will need, will need foreign labor. Well, the Philippines were not allowed, or Koreans were not allowed to become Japanese citizens. Japan is re-examining that now and allowing some citizenship. So on the one hand, there is this idea of, well, these people who want to leave will feel they have to leave their own country. They can't come to my country. But on the other hand, my country needs their labor. And within the 20th century, you will have to have movement of lots of people around the world. Even with, AI and computers and all the rest, there is a huge service sector in all countries and so on. Unless you have robots in nursing homes and get rid of people and whatever, you will need lots of foreign labor in the United States and in every country. In fact, even China and India will be confronting this sometime in the 20th century, that they will have to import labor. So the idea that you can maintain your hard shell around your state and not have anybody come in, and or if people are allowed temporarily in, you will only allow them to come in temporarily, is an idea which is eroding and will increasingly erode in this century. So you will have almost all states in the world have to include people of different nationalities, language groups, and so forth. Now, in the United States, of course, we're adjusted to having immigration, legal immigration. Let's deal with that for a minute. But there's always been discrimination of people from other countries who speak other languages and so forth. So in the 20th century, for example, we started developing a quota system. We had so many legal immigrants were allowed into the country, but only so many Irish or so many Italians or some other people. Why was that developed? It was developed a racism. We wanted to keep Asians out. But even when you talk about, different people being considered inappropriate as new citizens and residents, let me remind you of the fact I lived in New York in the 1950s. And at that time, Irish and Italians were being talked about in the same way that Venezuelans and Central Americans are being talked about. It was very racist and very derogatory comments about those people, Russians increasingly, and so forth. So it hasn't always been people from quote unquote under third world countries or people of color. Even Europeans were discriminated against. Up until late 19th or early 20th century, people were able to move around much more easily because while the states had hard borders, many states closed their eyes to the movement of people until the core, not the core, but the shell of states solidified for one reason or another, and people were discriminated against who came from other places. Now, I want to turn to international law on all of this, which is also relevant, because while allowing immigrants and quotas for immigrants is up to the states, what you do with asylum seekers is an entirely different category. Now, the idea of asylum did not exist until the early 1940s. Indeed, the word, the language and the international law really picked up and developed in the early part of the 1940s. I'll go back to that in a minute, but to say that that was caused in part by people being turned away whose lives were at risk. So you may or may not know from history that when the Nazis came to power and the discrimination and the beginning of the Holocaust on Jews, there were shiploads of Jews who came to the United States, and they were turned away and sent back to Germany and then perished in the concentration camps. So we have a pretty bad history about all of that. And for that not to be repeated, that is to say, people whose lives were at risk, the idea of asylum developed, and there was even a vocabulary which we use all the time now of people who are facing genocide. And the word genocide didn't get coined until 1944, when a Polish jurist, his name was Lemkin, coined the word. And he coined it from both Greek and Latin. The word geo of genocide means race in Greek, and the word CIDE, genocide, is Latin for killing. So race killing. And the idea, of course, was not of rescuing people who were dying economically, but who were at risk for political and religious, sometimes sexual identification, gays, and so forth. And genocide became something that is now, part of our vocabulary and part of how we think about the world. The problem with the idea of genocide is that when it occurs, it has to be named. So, for example, in Rwanda, where genocide was going on in the 1990s, it took a long time for the United States, for example, to be willing to call it genocide. Genocide has happened elsewhere in the world, and unless it's named as genocide, people can't get the relief and the possibility of moving somewhere where it's safe, or the protection, military protection, or other things. But certainly, genocide has been something that has been much discussed. You've no doubt read a lot about it. And in our contemporary world, the problem of asylum seekers is that the United States and other countries saying these people are not confronting, or they can't be covered by the definition of genocide because they're not being killed for racial or religious or the category of issues around which the word genocide was developed. They're coming because, why are they coming? For economic reasons. They can't make a living. For instability reasons. Venezuelans, economic distress, political distress. It's not that every Venezuelan who tries to come to the US thinks they're going to be sent to a concentration camp. It's the fact that they think their political and economic situations are hopeless. So part of the problem of today's asylum seekers is that they don't qualify under the normal definition of asylum as it was founded in the 1940s and integrated into international law. So asylum is part of international law, part of the UN system, part of the international courts, and so forth. The question is whether or not it qualifies as genocide. This is something that the international courts, both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, are wrestling with in terms of whether or not genocide is occurring in Gaza, for example, and now in Lebanon. So part of the problem is that the international law is out of date with what's actually happening in the world. So you now have these millions of people who are wanting to leave their country, mostly not because they confront genocide in the historical meaning of that term, but most of them who believe they can no longer survive and live for economic-political reasons, right? And so these 40, or 100 million people out there, 80 million people out there who are refugees, most of them don't qualify under the narrow definition of genocide, which means that countries just simply say, well, sorry, we're not going to have them. And somebody like Trump then refers to them as trash that are going to be exported. So, of course, instead of people showing up at borders, not just in the United States and elsewhere, and saying we would like in because we can't, make a living and we are living in a horrible society, we want to live and contribute to your society, the legal authorities at borders try to examine whether people have a justified cause of qualifying under the asylum laws based on genocide. So the system is out of kilter with the legal system is out of kilter with what's actually going on. Now, why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem when, you get denied asylum, you've just traveled and risked your life of yourself and your family, you've lost your farm because nothing grows anymore because of climate change, or you live in a, country like Venezuela right now, and you're saying, well, I need asylum. And then the people say, well, you don't qualify for asylum under the genocide provision. You should be sent back. Why don't you apply for regular immigration? Well, it will take you 5 years. You might be dead, maybe 10 years until you go under the, immigration departmental policies and so forth. It's very difficult to immigrate into the United States and many other countries. Now, the U.S. is in particularly bad shape because of all of this, of its location in Latin America and so forth. But this is an issue that is Europe is confronting. There are countries that are chucking out parts of the population. For example, Myanmar, the old Burma, got rid of over almost 2 million people. The Rohingya, why? Because they're Muslims. They chased them out, and they're mostly now living in refugee camps in Bangladesh and so forth. That does that qualify under genocide? Well, some of it, because they were killing people along the way. But there are all kinds of gray areas now where the law has not caught up with the actual situation, and international policy has not caught up with the actual situation. So let me take Europe, which is generally speaking been in the last 20 years or so better than the United States on some of these issues. The European Union has made a law and treaty that if you qualify to enter one European Union country, you can move to any other. Well, that's not being adhered to right now either. For example, Hungary will not allow any refugees from the Ukraine or anywhere else into the country. Other countries are questioning those situations. Boat people arrive from France, and they're North Africans and West Africans and so forth. Do the people in some African countries qualify that their lives are at risk? Certainly in the Sudan right now, which I want to talk about sometime down the road, which is actually the largest human disaster in the world right now. It's a large country in civil war. More people are starving to death and getting killed than anywhere else in the world, including the Middle East. So we're living in a very messy world we're living in a very nasty world. We're living in a world where many people believe they cannot sustain themselves or their family where they live politically, socially, but increasingly economically, and that promises to get worse because of climate change. So the US in particular used to be, viewed in the last, let's say, post-World War period as a country which was reasonable, advanced, had, reasonable policies, allowed people in and so forth. And given the current politics of it, and given the Trump administration, we are now viewed as, to put it mildly, a pariah in the world of how we're treating people and how we will treat people if Trump gets his way. Just a sort of small aside, some of the asylum seekers who are let out into the public in the U.S., who haven't been sent back, as their asylum claims are processed, and often it takes many years, in the meantime have some children, and those children are Americans. What does Trump say about that? Well, when I kick these people out, they have a choice. They can take their American kids with them, or they can leave them here and get them adopted or some relatives. In other words, there's a really kind of cruel and inhumane aspect to it. And as you know, still within the United States, we have a generation of kids, the DACA children, who have lived here almost all their lives, who don't have citizenship, who've been protected. Many of them now are professionals, lawyers, doctors, whatnots. And the Biden administration has tried to see whether or not they cannot be legalized. Many of these kids have never left, since they were babies, have never lived in a different country, don't speak the languages of their country where their parents came from. So our sort of inhumanity about this is not only shocking for those of us who feel that people should be treated better and differently, especially since people contribute to our society who may not be legal, and we need them in our society. But also it's shocking of how we talk about it all, because we're living in a century where not just the United States, but every other country has to confront, because of climate change in particular, but also because of aging populations and economic needs of all countries, of having to confront issues of people being able to move more easily and being able to lay down roots and become part of the society, even though for the first generation they may be hyphenated. And let me end just on one point, again, talking about our local situation. When you talk about people, they say, well, the Europeans, when they came to the United States, they at least learned English. But all these Spanish-speaking people, they don't even speak English. They're changing our country. Look at Watsonville. They all speak Spanish. Indeed, they do. But what people forget is that the first generation tends to speak the language that they grew up in. Sometimes they learn some English, sometimes more, sometimes less. The children, generally speaking, may still speak the language of their parents, but also speak the local language, and in the case of the United States, English. This is also true in Watsonville. Why is it that we have the impression that people in Watsonville simply don't learn English? Because the younger generation moves out. They go to Cabrillo, they go to UCSC, they speak English, they become they may speak both languages. You go to any doctor's office nowadays, there's somebody sitting there who speaks both English and Spanish. These are the offspring of people who, of course, have learned to speak English like other first-generation immigrants, but who may also speak a second language, which nowadays it's rather useful to be able to speak a second language in this sort of interdependent world. So there is not just prejudice on the part of sort of right-wing and sort of Trump type people in the United States, there's also a lot of misinformation, which even fairly liberal people often participate in. So unless we start having a conversation with ourselves, both nationally and internationally, of how the world will have to keep having people move around the world in the rest of the century, both because of climate change and because of economic necessity, we will all be in a lot of difficulty, and it is authoritarians, dare we say fascists, like Trump, who will get elected in various places, but to the detriment of the countries that they lead and to the detriment of having a peaceful, somewhat democratic, and livable world for the rest of the century. Thank you very much. See you in 2 weeks.